Okay, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to be talking about Jezebels today in The Handmaid's Tale. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the biblical origins of Jezebel. You're going to find out about what kind of woman she was. I'm going to apply this to the commander's character. And finally, I'm going to show you how the commander is revealed to be a terrible hypocrite. And an AO3 point for you might be to compare this to corrupt communist officials. Because as I'm sure you realized in Russia, the idea was that you shouldn't have luxury. But ironically, the people who ran the government often lived an incredibly luxurious life. Now, this is Jezebel here. Literally, Jezebel is the most hated, the woman who is held in the greatest contempt in the Bible. And the reason for this is that Jezebel was married to King Ahab, who was king of the Jews and was seen as a great loyal servant of God. Jezebel was a highly sexualized, very pretty woman, and what she did is she corrupted her husband and she got him to worship Baal. I'll show you a picture of Baal. Here's Baal. Baal was a god, an idol god from what is modern-day Iraq. Then it was called Babylon. And a lot of the practices of Baal were considered despicable, like free love and drinking, etc., like that, okay? So why is Jezebel so important? Well, I can't think of a worse story, because after Jezebel corrupts her husband, her punishment is perhaps the worst I've ever heard of. She was taken by the members of the court and she was thrown out of the tower. That doesn't sound too bad, but her corpse was then fed to dogs, and some people say that she was partially alive as she was eaten. Okay, so it's like something out of Game of Thrones, isn't it? Yeah. So Jezebel was punished in this way. Now, what I want to point out to you, what's so interesting about that, is that Jezebel is obviously therefore held in contempt. It's a misogynistic biblical story of what happens to women, and it's a terrible fate, isn't it? Isn't it therefore really interesting that the commander and his friends choose to call their nightclub Jezebels? And it shows you a contradiction at the heart of patriarchy. On the one hand, supposed sluts are hated and they're controlled in Gilead. But when the commanders and his friends want to go out and have a good time and be with someone who turns them on and stimulates them, they actually choose the idea of calling this place Jezebels. So I think at this point you have to admit that we've seen the commander domesticated through Scrabble. Now I think we're going to see the commander as a despicable hypocrite, as a liar, as a man who created one society, Gilead, that he actually now despises, and that he's created a kind of underworld which is there for the elite and for the elite only. So we talked about Baal. Now some of you will know this man here because he died last week. It's Hugh Hefner, and he is obviously the controller of the giant franchise Playboy. Now, this is very important in the novel that we know about Playboy, because as we're going to see when we meet Moira, who's also working in Jezebel's, she is dressed as a playgirl. Now, Hugh Hefner, above all men, I think, was hated by feminists in the 70s and 80s for a whole variety of reasons. Firstly, they would see him as somebody who encouraged the objectification of women. Secondly, I think the fact that women wore bunny ears and bunny tails really does reduce them and make them into pitiful kind of objects. Although it has to be said, when I visited Japan, I noticed lots of 40-year-old women dressed as Hello Kitty. Very disturbing indeed. In this photo here, this is the original Bunny Girls. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them, and I'm going to tell you about a feminist called Gloria Steinem who particularly hated them and who I think Margaret Atwood is quite influenced by. Playboy, when it first started off in the 1970s, was an incredibly clever magazine. Because what Hugh Hefner said is that in the past, women had been confined. They weren't allowed to be sexual beings. So he said, basically, by having all of these naked spreads and stuff like that, he actually saw himself as a kind of proponent of free love and of woman's pleasure. That's how he presented himself. The commander doesn't do that, does he? But it's a very awkward scene, I think we'll agree, when he asks her to get dressed up in the ostrich feathers. For two reasons. Firstly, it seems so inappropriate for a commander to be this way. Secondly, Offred is a graduate. She's a mother, isn't she? She's actually a woman in what appears to be in her 30s. And this seems like quite an adolescent and rather sad thing to ask of her. And it means that there's a curious alliance between the commander and Hugh Hefner. You know, in many ways they kind of resemble each other. Both of them get off on reducing and degrading women. Now, when we actually go to Jezebel's, it is a kind of harem. Do you recall that earlier in the novel that Offred uses the term harem, which is obviously an Arabic term, and it goes back to the days when very important men were allowed to have collections of women who were kept in a tent and were their lovers, and their sole reason for existence was to be there as lovers for these powerful men. So it's all to do, I think, partly with waiting as well. You'll notice when they go to Jezebel's, a lot of the women wait around, don't they? And so male erotica and male sexual pleasure seems to be to do with power, doesn't it? Going back to Hugh Hefner here now, we're going to see, I think, that Margaret Atwood is going to be attacking him, because we could see Jezebel's as one of his clubs, okay? And in A Bunny Tale, Gloria Steinem, here she is over here, this is her much older. When she was young, she was very attractive. So she hated the whole idea of the bunny girl. So guess what she did? She got a job as a bunny girl. And she spent many months working as a bunny girl so that she could write an in-depth study of what life was like as a bunny girl. And of course, all of this was pretty condemnatory. She was sexually assaulted all of the time. They didn't pay the bunny girls, guys. Like a lot of waitresses, they lived purely off tips. They put up with all kind of sexual harassment from the bosses, and secretly they were encouraged to sleep with the clients. Obviously, that would attract them. So whilst they were meant to be waitresses, really they were kind of like semi-prostitutes. So I'm wondering whether we could see A Handmaid's Tale in terms of the same kind of genre as A Bunny Tale, where as a feminist, Margaret Atwood is trying to reveal what lies beneath the surface. She's presenting the ugly reality of the way that women are treated in these clubs. Now, what I thought was really interesting is the commander, we know, enjoys watching Offred read, partly because it's forbidden. But one of the magazines that he actually gets her to read is Ms. magazine. Do you recall this? Which is an extremely feminist magazine. Offred didn't read it. Do you remember she said, "I saw my mother reading it"? Now, one of the things about Offred is she's no radical feminist, is she? Arguably, you could say she's a little bit repressed by Luke. That's something that we might look at another time. But it's interesting that the commander chose her to read a feminist magazine, and guess who wrote for this magazine? Gloria Steinem was one of the writers, the principal writers. So why is it, we have to ask ourselves, that the commander is so excited by watching Offred read this magazine? And it seems to be tied up, with, as far as I can see, with the idea that he enjoys breaking the rules. He enjoys the fact that he is powerful and is able to break the rules. And it's this sense of power that seems to be linked to his ideas of sexuality. But there's a paradox in patriarchy, as I say here. In Gilead, the sexual woman is a despicable monster who gets sent to the colonies, is she not? It's wrong for women to be sexualized in any way. So how then do we explain Jezebel's, the hidden underbelly of Gilead, where rather than being criminalized, highly sexualized women are cultivated and fetishized? And it's almost like Margaret Atwood is telling us, like Victorian times, if you ban sexuality, then it will find other ways of manifesting, and often in quite ugly ways. This you could link to a kind of Freudian theory of repression. When you push things down, you push them down, eventually they'll explode out in another place. But of course, Jezebel's is just for commanders, isn't it? It's a place for the elites. Now, it's quite interesting that Judith Butler is a very famous feminist theorist, and she talks about gender as performance. She says that a woman and a man, it's not what you are biologically, it's how you act. And if you think about it, very interestingly, in Jezebel, all the women have to act a role, don't they? They have to go back to these ideas of lingerie and sexuality. They're all over made up, aren't they? They're all in despicable, brash kind of lingerie. And it's like, why is it that the commanders want to return to this world that they supposedly despise? And that is the conundrum for you guys to think about in this class. How we explain this about Gilead, how we explain this about the commander. One thing's for true is that I've included this picture here from Animal Farm. I think some of you have read Animal Farm or you're familiar with it. You will recall that Animal Farm is George Orwell's attack on communism and its hypocrisy. And the people that run the farm after they overthrow the farmers are the pigs. The pigs at first start with the slogan, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. Humans are bad. But we see that they start to change the rules and they start to make everything really good for themselves. By the end of the book, the pigs have taught themselves to walk on 2 legs. Do you recall this? They change the slogan from 4 legs good to 4 legs good, 2 legs better. It's like they've come full circle. I'm going to link this to Russia and the parachiks. When I went to an East German supermarket, in 1985, I went to East Germany on a tour. I was very lucky before communism fell down. Literally, you would go to the supermarket those days and they would have potatoes or they would have cabbages or they would have sauerkraut in a can, but there wasn't much on the supermarket shelves. When they broke into the communist buildings after communism fell, they found vodka, champagne, caviar, luxury. And when the communist officials were asked, how can it be? We're all meant to be equal. They came out with exactly the same arguments that we are going to see from the commander. You will recall that the commander says many things like, what is good for us is not good for the multitude. Do you remember that? We are in charge. We are above reproach. We are the elite. It's different for us. So when we look at Jezebels now, I want you to hold that in your mind and think about the number of people who have been hypocrites, who have been powerful and have said one thing and done another.